A man feared by the valley, a woman nobody would even glance at, and a cruel winter will force them both to confront what no one dares admit, that true strength doesn't come from muscle or resilience, but from the courage to stand by the man the world has abandoned. This is the story of Duncan Voss, the mountain man Blackridge Valley calls a monster, and Eliza Hartwell, the only woman unafraid of him. Like, comment the city you're watching from so I know how far this story has progressed. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next installments. The story of Duncan Voss started, like most things in Blackridge Valley, with a winter that nearly killed everybody. Not the winter Eliza Hartwell almost lost her farm. Not the one that came later, when the valley would learn what Duncan was actually made of. This was an earlier winter, 6 years before the matchmaking gathering, back when Duncan was still just a name people said quietly, the way you'd mention a rattlesnake you spotted near the trail. You named it so others knew to watch their step, but you didn't linger on it. He'd come to the valley in the spring of 1887, nobody knew exactly from where. Some said Montana, some said Wyoming. One old man at the feed store swore Duncan had walked out of the Bitterroot Range with nothing but the coat on his back and a hatchet tucked into his belt, and that he'd traded a winter's worth of trapped pelts for a plot of land so remote that even the surveyor had refused to ride out to stake it properly. What everybody agreed on was this: Duncan Voss was large in a way that made other large men feel ordinary. 6'4", maybe more, built like the timber he hauled, broad through the chest and shoulder, thick-armed, with hands that looked capable of snapping fence posts without much effort. His hair was dark and ran a little long, and he kept a beard that was not groomed in any way that suggested he thought about it much. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of sky before a bad storm, and he had a habit of holding them very still when he looked at you, which most people found unsettling. He kept to himself. That was the first thing the valley learned about him. He bought his supplies in town 4, maybe 5 times a year, paid in cash, spoke to no one unless directly addressed, and was back on his mountain before noon. He didn't attend church. He didn't attend town meetings. He didn't join the volunteer fire crew that formed after the Hadley barn burned in the summer of '88, though people noted afterward that Duncan had shown up during the blaze itself, not to socialize, but to haul water buckets at a pace that 3 men couldn't match, and then left without a word once the fire was out. The legend of him built up the way frost builds on a window, slowly, overnight, until you couldn't see through it anymore. There was the story about the wolves. 3 of them had come out of the tree line in early December of that first winter, gone after Hank Pierce's sheep pen. Hank got his rifle and found Duncan Voss already there in the dark, between the wolves and the pen, no weapon on him that Hank could see. He'd driven them off, Hank said. Just driven them off. Hank never got specific about how exactly, and after a while people stopped asking because the answer always made Hank go a little quiet. There was the story about the Carmichael brothers, 2 men from a neighboring county who'd tried to harvest timber off the eastern ridge that butted against Duncan's land. They came back to town without their wagon and without their tools and wouldn't say a word about what had happened up there. One of them had a bruised jaw. Neither of them ever came back to Blackridge Valley. There was the story, quieter and told only in careful company, about the time Duncan had carried a man named Grover Ames down from the North Pass during a February blizzard. Grover had gone up to check a trap line and broken his leg on the ice. He'd been out there for 2 days before Duncan found him, more dead than alive, and carried him 6 miles through the snow. Grover said Duncan hadn't spoken a single word the entire way down, just carried him like cargo and left him at Doc Hensler's door and walked back into the storm. Grover tried to thank him in town the following spring. Duncan looked at him for a long moment, nodded once, and kept walking. That was Duncan Voss. He was not a man who invited interpretation. He existed, he worked, and he kept his own counsel, and the valley had mostly decided that the simplest explanation for all of it was that he was not quite right in the head. Too much time alone. Too much mountain. Whatever had been human in him had been slowly filed away by years of solitude until what was left was something closer to the landscape he lived in. Useful, maybe, in the way that a mountain is useful, but not something you'd want in your kitchen. So when Reverend Aldous Crane announced the Blackridge Valley matchmaking gathering in the fall of 1893, and when someone pointed out that Duncan Voss had actually paid the entry fee and would be in attendance, The reaction was a mixture of disbelief and dark humor. "That man doesn't need a wife," said Clara Potts, who ran the dry goods store with her husband and had opinions about everything. "He needs a keeper." "He needs a bath," said her husband, which was funnier to everyone except the three men in the room who'd gone longer than a month without one. The gathering was Reverend Crane's idea, though the practical organizing had fallen mostly to a woman named Agnes Whitfield, who was efficient and relentless and had very strong feelings about frontier loneliness being a solvable problem. The valley had 60-odd households by then, and a significant portion of them were single men, farmers, ranchers, a few trappers, who had come west with the intention of building a life and discovered that a life without a partner was mostly just a long list of chores performed alone. There were fewer single women, which meant the gathering would draw attendees from 3 surrounding counties, and Agnes had made sure the word went out far enough that they'd have decent numbers on both sides. It was scheduled for the first Saturday of October, held at the community hall in the center of Black Ridge, which was the largest enclosed space in the valley and smelled permanently of pine resin and old coffee. Agnes had the place cleaned and strung with lanterns. Someone donated a fiddle player and his nephew on guitar. There were tables set up along one wall with food contributed by the various households, and Agnes had arranged a loose system where the men would be introduced to the women in small groups, conversations encouraged, no pressure, very civil. That was the plan. By 8 o'clock, the hall was crowded with nearly 40 people, and there was a noticeable clustering happening near the far wall. Specifically, a cluster of women who were positioning themselves as far from one corner of the room as politely possible. That corner was where Duncan Voss stood. He was wearing clean clothes, which surprised people. Dark trousers, a gray flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearm. He'd trimmed his beard. His boots were the same scarred work boots he always wore, but they appeared to have been brushed recently. He stood slightly apart from the other men. One shoulder leaned against the wall, holding a tin cup of something he wasn't drinking, watching the room without any apparent discomfort. That was the thing about Duncan. He was never visibly uncomfortable. He just existed in whatever space he occupied, and the space arranged itself around him. Agnes had paired him with 3 women in the first rotation. All 3 had found reasons to move on quickly. The second rotation was worse. One woman had caught sight of him from across the room and taken a sudden interest in the food table. Word had traveled, the way it always does in small rooms, and by the third rotation, Agnes was having to actively recruit participants. "I cannot make them talk to him," Agnes said to her husband in a hissed conversation near the door. "I can put them in front of him, but I cannot make them see past the size of the man." "You want me to talk to him?" "I want you to stand closer to him and look friendly. You are the same height as every other man here, but proximity might help." It didn't particularly help. What happened instead was this. Duncan, somewhere around the midpoint of the evening, did something no one expected. A woman named Helen Marsh, who had come from the Sutton Valley 2 counties east and was widely considered one of the better prospects at the gathering, worked up her nerve and approached him. She was pretty in a practical way, well-spoken, and she'd been told by Agnes that she ought to at least try. She introduced herself. Duncan looked at her, said something quiet, and within 2 minutes she was walking away with a tight expression and a very careful posture. It went like that 3 more times. Different women, same result. Not rudeness, exactly. Nobody could say Duncan had been rude, but something. He'd look at them, he'd listen, he'd speak. A few words, short, and then somehow the conversation would be over, and the woman would be walking back toward the safer end of the room. By 9 o'clock, the room had quietly reached a consensus. Duncan Voss had rejected every woman who'd approached him. The conclusion was fast and certain. He was too proud, too strange. Whatever small hope some had entertained that the mountain man might be, underneath all of it, a person who wanted ordinary things, that hope was finished. Tom Greeley, who farmed the land south of the creek and drank more than was good for him, said it loud enough for a good portion of the room to hear. "Man doesn't want a wife. Man wants a trophy." There was laughter. Duncan's expression didn't change. So, Eliza Hartwell had arrived late. She'd been held up by a fence section that had come down on the east side of her pasture, and she'd spent 40 minutes in the dying light hammering it back into something functional before she could get the horses in and get herself cleaned up and make the 3-mile drive to town. She'd worn her best dress, which was navy blue wool and 3 years old and fit her the way things fit when you'd bought them during a time when you weren't as heavy as you were now. Which is to say, it fit technically, but there wasn't room for error. Eliza Hartwell was what the Valley's women, in their kinder moments, called a sturdy woman. She was 31 years old, stood 5'5", and had a build that suggested a person who worked hard physical labor every day. Broad-shouldered, solid-hipped, with arms that were stronger than most men assumed, and a face that was plain but animated, the kind of face that looked better when she was talking than when she was still. She had brown hair that she kept pinned up, though strands were always escaping it by midday. She had a habit of looking people directly in the eye when she talked to them, which some found refreshing and some found unnerving. She was not considered a beauty in Black Ridge Valley. This was a thing she'd made her peace with years ago, the way you make peace with a fence line that runs crooked. It's crooked. There it is. At some point, you stop losing sleep over it. She taught school, 12 students in a single-room schoolhouse on the western edge of the valley, grades 1 through 8, everything from arithmetic to history to basic Latin because Eliza had gone to a proper school herself before her family's money ran out, and she'd gone west to make her own way. She was good at it. Her students learned, which was not a guarantee with frontier school teachers, many of whom lasted one winter before finding something less exhausting. Eliza had lasted 6 years. She also ran a homestead that her late father had left her, 40 acres on the south slope with a decent well and a small herd of cattle and a kitchen garden that she expanded every spring. She did most of the work herself. She had a neighbor, old Bert Cassidy, who helped occasionally in exchange for eggs, and a student's father who came to help with the hay in summer, but mostly it was her own labor that kept the place running. This meant she was tired in a way that had become so consistent it barely registered anymore. It was just the baseline condition, like weather. She'd come to the gathering because Agnes had asked her directly, and saying no to Agnes Whitfield required more energy than Eliza had left at the end of a school week. She didn't have strong feelings about finding a husband. She'd had feelings about it once, years ago, a specific set of feelings about a man who'd eventually married someone else, and after that she'd found it easier not to have them. Work was something you could control. Work didn't leave for the Connolly girl from the next valley over. She came in through the side door, shook the cold off her coat, and stood at the edge of the room for a moment taking stock. The first thing she noticed was the sound, the gathering hum of too many people in one space, conversations layered over the fiddle player who was working through something cheerful in the corner. The second thing she noticed was the food table, because she hadn't eaten since noon, and it was now pushing 9. She made her way toward it. She was halfway through a piece of cornbread when she became aware that someone had moved into the space next to her. Not close enough to be intrusive, just close enough that she could see them in her peripheral vision. She glanced over. Duncan Voss was standing 2 feet away, looking at the food table with the expression of a man trying to decide if he was hungry or just bored. Eliza looked at him for a moment. He was large, up close, larger than the stories made him sound, which was considerable because the stories did not undersell his size. She registered this the way she registered most physical facts: noted, filed, moved on. "The apple cake is better than it looks," she said, because she had just eaten a piece of it, and this was accurate. Duncan looked at her. Not the way he'd looked at the other women, apparently. She didn't know about those interactions yet. He just looked at her, a plain, direct look. "Looks fine," he said. "It does not look fine. It looks like someone sat on it." She took another bite of cornbread. "But it tastes better than it looks," which is the relevant information. A pause. Then Duncan reached over and took a piece of the apple cake. He ate it, standing there. Eliza ate the rest of her cornbread. Neither of them spoke for maybe 2 minutes, which should have been awkward and wasn't particularly because Eliza was tired and hungry and not performing for anyone tonight, and Duncan, as far as she could tell, didn't perform regardless. "You're Duncan Voss," she said finally. Not a question. "You're the school teacher." Eliza Hartwell. She didn't offer her hand because she was still holding cornbread, and also because the handshake convention for women and men at these gatherings was slightly ambiguous. "You've been having a rough evening from what I can see." He looked at her sideways. "What do you see?" "A man standing at the food table alone at 9 o'clock. She shrugged. "I'm doing the same thing, so I'm not throwing stones." Something shifted in his expression, not a smile, not quite, but something moved. "They think I rejected them," he said. "Didn't you? I wasn't rude to them." "That's not the same thing." She finally looked at him directly. "You gave them a short conversation and nothing more. That reads as rejection whether you meant it that way or not." He was quiet for a moment. "They were afraid. Some of them, probably. I don't know how to talk to someone who's afraid of me." Eliza considered this. It was a more honest answer than she'd expected. "That's a real problem," she said. "I know." She brushed the cornbread crumbs off her hands and looked out at the room. Agnes was giving her a look from across the hall that meant something, though Eliza wasn't sure what. She turned back to the food table. "Well," she said, "I'm not afraid of you, but I'm also not looking for a husband tonight, so I'm not particularly useful to you in that context." "What are you looking for?" "I was looking for the apple cake," she said. "I found it. The evening is already a success." This time, something that was definitely closer to a smile crossed his face. Not full, more like the outline of one. They stood there another few minutes, talking without talking. That particular frontier thing where you stand near someone and exchange words about nothing important, and both understand something has been communicated anyway. Then Agnes descended on them with the targeted efficiency of a woman on a mission, and the moment broke apart, and Eliza went to talk to a woman from Sutton Valley who taught music, and Duncan went back to his corner. Eliza didn't think much about it afterward. She had a fence to repair, and 30 papers to grade, and 200 pounds of winter provisions to get in before the first hard frost. She drove home through the cold and thought about her supply list and forgot, mostly, that the conversation had happened. She did not forget the way he'd said they were afraid. That flat, matter-of-fact statement, with no self-pity in it, just a man naming a condition of his life the way you'd name the weather. She thought about that, a little, on the drive home. Then the first snow came, and she stopped thinking about anything except surviving it. October ended badly, and November was worse. The snow came early, 3 weeks early, according to old-timers who'd been tracking such things for 30 years. And it came hard, a sustained series of storms that rolled in from the north with almost no break between them. By the second week of November, the valley floor had 3 feet of snow on it, and the temperatures at night were dropping into ranges that killed livestock that weren't properly sheltered. Eliza's farm took the first hit on a Tuesday. A section of her cattle shed roof gave under the weight of accumulated snow, partial collapse, enough that 2 of her animals were injured and she'd had to spend a day in brutal cold improvising a repair she wasn't sure would hold. The materials she used were what she had on hand, which was not the right materials. She got through it. She got through most things. That was what her life had become. A series of crises managed with whatever was available. The gap between managing and not managing never quite as wide as she'd like. She'd been running the homestead at a loss for 2 years, small enough losses that she could cover them with her teaching wages, but the losses were consistent, and consistent losses go in one direction. She knew that. She was not stupid about numbers. December arrived, the storms continued. Several families in the valley lost significant portions of their harvest stores to the cold and the damp, and there was a general grimness settling over Blackridge. The particular grimness of people who are calculating whether they have enough to get through to spring and coming up with answers they don't like. Eliza had a neighbor 3/4 of a mile east, a widow named Frances Dodd, who came by one afternoon with a look on her face that meant she was carrying news she wasn't sure how to deliver. "You didn't go to the Harmon place today," Frances said. "I had school." "What happened at the Harmon place?" "Their well froze and their stores got into the wet somehow. They've lost most of their winter grain." Frances paused. Margaret Harmon was crying in the middle of the day, which is not a woman who cries easy. Eliza absorbed this. The Harmons had 3 children. "I'll see what I can spare from my stores," she said. "You can't spare anything." "I know." A pause. "I'll see what I can spare anyway." That was the winter in miniature. Everyone gave what they couldn't afford to give, and it still wasn't enough, and everyone knew it wasn't enough, and they did it anyway. What Eliza did not know, could not have known, because she saw no evidence of it, was that sometime in the third week of November, someone had reinforced the back section of her cattle shed. The temporary repair she'd made with wrong materials had been supplemented overnight with proper crossbeam work and fresh lumber. She noticed it one morning when she went to check on the animals, noticed the newness of the wood, the different cut, and stood there for a while trying to understand what she was looking at. She asked Francis if she'd sent someone. Francis hadn't. She asked old Bert Cassidy. He said it wasn't him, too much work for his knees in this cold, but there was something slightly careful about the way he said it. She didn't pursue it. There were too many other things to pursue. 2 weeks later, she found firewood. Not a little, a substantial amount, stacked properly under the lean-to against the north side of the house, exactly where she kept her wood. She went through her woodpile every few days and knew what she had, and suddenly she had more than she'd had. A lot more. Split and stacked like someone had spent hours at it. Again she asked. Again nothing resolved. Again, Bert Cassidy was carefully neutral. She stood at the woodpile in the gray December afternoon and thought about the gathering in October and a man who'd said they were afraid with no complaint in his voice. Just the plain fact of it. She thought about it, and then she went inside and stoked the fire with wood that had appeared from somewhere. And she didn't say anything to anyone. The gossip reached her in January the way gossip always did, through one of her students. 12-year-old Robbie Pierce, son of Hank Pierce, the sheep farmer, came in one morning with the barely contained energy of a child who knows something that adults haven't officially told him yet. He made it to lunch before it came out. "My pa says Duncan Voss is helping your farm." Eliza looked up from the papers she was reading. "Is that right?" she said. "He says he's seen Duncan's tracks in the snow near your east fence 2 times. Big tracks." Robbie spread his hands apart to demonstrate, which was not scientifically rigorous but communicated the intention. "Pa says a man that big leaves tracks like a plow horse. Your father should mind his own affairs." He was checking his own sheep fence, so he was already out there. Eliza could not easily argue with this. "Finish your lunch, Robbie." The lunch break ended. The afternoon continued, but the information had changed something, confirmed something she'd been half thinking and half refusing to think. She drove home that evening through cold that had teeth in it and sat in her kitchen for a while without taking off her coat. She was not a sentimental woman, or she'd trained herself not to be, which comes to the same thing over time. She didn't romanticize. She looked at things straight. What she saw, looked at straight, was this. A man who had spent his life being feared and avoided was quietly doing labor for her in the dark, not announcing it, not asking for thanks, not expecting acknowledgement, just doing it. She didn't know what to do with that. She also didn't know what the valley was making of it. She found out the following Sunday at the Blackridge General Store. The Saturday General Store gathering was the informal news exchange of the valley. People came to buy things and stayed to talk, and the talk covered everything from weather to crops to the various personal dramas that kept frontier life from being entirely about work. Eliza went every week for supplies and usually stayed long enough to be polite. She was reaching for a sack of flour when she heard Clara Potts say her name, not quietly. Doesn't matter what he does at her farm. A woman like Eliza Hartwell deserves better than that man's charity. Eliza stood still, back to the room, hand on the flour. "She can't help who leaves wood at her door," said another woman, someone Eliza couldn't place by voice. "She can send it back." "In this cold, with her stores as thin as they are?" "It's the principle." Clara's voice carried the particular confidence of someone who'd never had thin stores. "Taking help from Duncan Voss means owing something to Duncan Voss, and no woman should want to owe that man anything. I don't care how much wood he splits." "What's wrong with him splitting wood if she needs—" "He's not right." A short silence. "You know what I mean. Everyone knows it. He drove off those Carmichael brothers with his bare hands. He lives up there alone like an animal. Why is he suddenly interested in Eliza Hartwell's cattle shed? I'll tell you why. Because she didn't run from him at the gathering. Because she talked to him." A pause waited with significance. "And now, here we are." Eliza picked up her flour and turned around. Clara Potts saw her and had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable, which was more than most people would have gotten from Clara. "I could hear you," Eliza said. Her voice was even. "Just so you know." Clara lifted her chin. "Then you heard my honest opinion." I heard you speculate about things you don't know anything about. Eliza set the flower on the counter. Duncan Voss may or may not be leaving firewood at my door. I don't know for certain who it is. What I know is that I've got 40 acres to run on a schoolteacher's wages in the worst winter in 6 years. And whoever is making that work slightly less impossible, I'm not ashamed of that. No one said, "You implied it." She looked at Clara directly. "You implied that a woman in my situation accepting help from a man in his situation is something to be embarrassed about. I disagree." The store was quiet in the way stores get when everyone is pretending to look at merchandise. "He's not," Clara started. "He's a man who keeps to himself and makes people nervous," Eliza said. "That's the sum of what you actually know about Duncan Voss." She paid for her flower. "Good day, Clara." She left. Outside in the cold, she took a breath and let it out and watched it fog. Her hands were shaking slightly, which annoyed her because she hadn't been that angry. She'd been something else, something more complicated that she didn't have a name for standing on a frozen street with flour under her arm. She went to his land on a Thursday in late January. She told herself she was going because the situation was ambiguous and needed to be made clear. She told herself she was going because she didn't like being in someone's debt without acknowledging it. Both of these things were true. She packed a tin of tea and a jar of jam she'd put up in September and drove her wagon as far north as the track allowed, then tied the horse and walked the last half-mile on foot through knee-deep snow with the tin in the jar tucked under her arm. His cabin came into view through the trees. Solid, large, built with the kind of careful precision that meant someone had taken their time with it. There were outbuildings. A woodshed stacked so high with split timber it looked like a small fortress. Elk and deer hide stretched on frames, a lean-to with tools organized in a way that told you the person who owned them actually used them. She knocked. There was a pause long enough that she considered leaving, and then the door opened and Duncan Voss filled the frame. He looked at her, at the tin and the jar, back at her face. "I walked half a mile in this snow," she said. "You're going to let me in." He stepped back from the door. The inside of his cabin was warmer than she expected. Good stove, good draft, and cleaner than she'd anticipated, though she'd not let herself form expectations in that direction. There were books on a shelf, which she registered and then deliberately did not comment on. There was a table, 2 chairs, a cot against the far wall, and all the structures of a life lived alone and organized around work. She set the tin and the jar on the table. "Tea," she said, "and blackberry jam from my garden. The berries were good this year." She sat down in one of the chairs without being invited to. "You've been fixing things at my farm." Duncan stood in the middle of the room. He looked at the items on the table, then at her. "Some things needed fixing," he said. "They did. I'm not here to tell you to stop. I'm here because I don't like owing things I haven't acknowledged." She met his eyes. "So, thank you. The shed would have come down again. The wood has kept me through the worst of it." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression was doing a thing she couldn't quite read. Not discomfort, not surprise, something more careful than either. "You're not angry," he said. "Why would I be angry? Most people would rather be cold than owe me something. Then most people are foolish about pride." He sat down in the other chair. It was a movement so deliberate it was almost formal, a man who rarely sat down with other people, sitting down. "How bad are your stores?" he said. Not a question, exactly. More like he'd been doing arithmetic in his head and wanted to check his figures. "I'll get through spring." A pause. "Probably." "That's not the same as yes." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." They talked for an hour. Not about the gathering, not about the gossip, not about anything that the valley would have found interesting. They talked about the winter, specifically its mechanical impacts on the valley, which farms were in real trouble, what the next cold system might bring, where the most vulnerable points were in her particular piece of land. Duncan knew things about this terrain that she didn't. He'd lived on these ridges through 4 winters, and he understood the weather patterns, the way you understand something you've had to survive repeatedly. He was not in conversation what the valley thought he was. He was not wild. He was not difficult. He was private in the way that some people are private, because the world had given him reason to be, not because there was nothing there. He chose his words with the same deliberate care he apparently chose everything. And when he said something, it was worth listening to. She left before dark because dark came fast this time of year, and the horse knew the way home, but she didn't like to push it. She pulled on her coat at the door. "You don't have to keep doing it in secret," she said. "The work." He looked at her steadily. "The valley will talk," he said. "The valley talks anyway." She buttoned her coat. "I'd rather they talked about something that was actually happening." She walked back to her horse in the gray winter afternoon. She didn't look back, but she heard the cabin door close. Not shut hard, just closed, quietly, the way you'd close a door at the end of something that wasn't finished. February brought 3 more storms and a level of hardship across the valley that began to feel less like weather and more like something with intent. 4 families had already approached the Black Ridge Town Council about assistance, grain reserves, feed for livestock, emergency lumber. The council's ability to provide these things was limited. There was a meeting at the community hall in the second week of February that devolved into arguments, which was not unusual for valley meetings, but was unusual in its intensity. Eliza went. She sat in the back and listened to men debate problems they couldn't fully solve, while the women in the room kept their mouths largely closed. Not because they had nothing to say, but because the community hall's informal protocols made clear whose voices were expected in that space. Duncan Voss was not at the meeting. Of course he wasn't. The meeting ended without resolution, which was its own kind of resolution. Everyone went home knowing that the valley was going to get through this winter on the same thing it had always gotten through hard winters on, each other, in whatever incomplete and imperfect ways people manage. 3 days after that meeting, Eliza came home from school to find a note tucked under her door. It was written on the back of a piece of brown wrapping paper in handwriting that was careful and slightly larger than necessary, the handwriting of someone who'd learned it deliberately and was precise about it. "If you need anything, send word with Bert Cassidy. He knows how to find me." No signature. She didn't need one. She read it twice, folded it, and put it in the small box where she kept things she didn't want to lose. The storm that came at the end of February was the worst one. It came on a Friday night, and by Saturday morning, Eliza could not see her barn from her kitchen window, which was 40 feet away. Wind like a blunt instrument, temperatures that went somewhere no thermometer she owned could accurately measure. She got out to her animals 3 times that day, each time a careful negotiation with conditions that actively wanted her dead. Sunday morning, she found that the section of fence she'd repaired in October, the original fence that had started all of this, was down again. The post had finally given, the wood too old, the ground too frozen for the repair to hold. 3 of her cattle had wandered in the night. She spent 4 hours in that weather looking for them. She found 2. The third, a 3-year-old heifer she'd had since it was a calf, one she couldn't afford to lose, was simply gone, somewhere in the white emptiness beyond the east pasture. She was coming back in, numb in her hands and not feeling her feet, when she saw him. Duncan Voss was coming across her east field through the snow, carrying the missing heifer across his shoulders the way a man carries a fence post. The animal was alive. She could see it moving. He'd found it somewhere in that storm, in that landscape he understood, and he was carrying it home. He looked at her across the white field. She looked at him. She didn't cry about it. She wasn't a person who cried easily, and the cold was too severe for it anyway, and there was the practical matter of getting the animal settled and getting both of them inside before the temperature finished the job the storm had started. But something shifted, standing in that frozen field, watching a man she'd met at a food table in October carry her cattle home through a blizzard. Not sentiment. Not a story she told herself. Something real, the way cold is real. You can deny it all you like, but it's still shaping everything, still telling you what you can and cannot do. "Shelter," she said because her voice was working better than her other faculties at that moment. He nodded and carried the heifer to the barn, and she followed. They got the animal settled in 30 minutes. It was hypothermic, but alive, and Eliza had dried hay and a blanket she'd once bought for exactly this kind of circumstance. She worked on the heifer, and Duncan stood back and handed her things when she reached for them, and they didn't talk except in the practical language of the work. More hay, check the left rear leg, she'll be fine tonight if the temperature holds. When it was done, they stood in the barn and listened to the storm do its worst against the walls. "I don't know how you found her," she said. "I know where animals go in weather like this." He paused. "There's a cut in the ridge about a quarter-mile east, natural windbreak. Most things that get loose in a storm end up there eventually." "I would have lost her." "Probably." She looked at him in the dim barn light. He was covered in snow, ice in his beard, the kind of cold, chapped color on his face that meant hours outside in serious weather. He looked like the mountain he came from. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He hesitated. "Just a moment." "All right," he said. They went inside and Eliza made coffee, and the storm shook the house, and they sat at her kitchen table and drank it. And for the first time since October, they talked without any reason except that they wanted to. The coffee cups emptied. Outside, the storm said what it had to say and began, sometime around midnight, to say it more quietly. Eliza looked at the table, at her own hands around an empty cup, at the window, where the dark had begun to thin toward the pre-dawn gray that meant another day coming whether you were ready for it or not. "You should stay until daylight," she said. "The trek back is too dangerous in the dark after this." Duncan didn't argue. She set him up on the narrow daybed in the side room, gave him a blanket, and went to her own room. She lay there for a while in the dark, listening to the wind taper off. She thought about the valley, about Clara Potts and the store, and a woman like Eliza Hartwell deserves better. Better than what, exactly? Better than a man who carried her cattle home through a blizzard. Better than someone who fixed her shed in the dark without asking for credit. Better than someone who sat at her table at midnight and talked to her like she was worth listening to. She'd been told what she deserved by other people her whole life, and she'd mostly found that what they said she deserved had very little to do with what she actually needed. She fell asleep before she finished the thought, and when she woke up, it was just past dawn and the daybed was made up neatly, and he was gone, and on the table was his coffee cup, washed and placed upside down to dry, which was such a small and ordinary thing, and somehow the most telling detail of all of it. She stood at her kitchen table for a long time. Then she went out to check on the heifer, who had made it through the night, which was one thing, at least, that had gone right. One thing earned and solid in a winter that had tried hard to leave nothing standing. She could work with that. The heifer recovered. Eliza named her twice, which was not a sentimental name, but an accurate one. The animal had been given 2 chances and used both of them. She grazed in the south pasture once the snow thinned enough, and Eliza watched her sometimes from the kitchen window with something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was close. March came in cold and stayed that way, which was its habit in this part of the territory. The valley began its slow, unconvinced crawl toward spring. A few degrees of temperature here, a week without new snow there. The mud season that everyone dreaded because it made the roads nearly impassable and turned every errand into a negotiation with the earth. Eliza's school attendance dropped in the worst weeks. The children kept home to help with the renewed work of farms shaking themselves back to function after the winter's damage. She sent lessons home with the ones who had siblings still coming. Duncan came by twice in March. Not to do work, or not primarily. He'd appear in the late afternoon, which was when Eliza was usually finishing the outdoor chores before dark, and they'd find themselves doing whatever needed doing together without making a formal project of it. The second time he came by, he fixed the east fence post that had finally given in the February storm, and Eliza stood next to him and held the post level while he packed and tamped the frozen earth around the base, and they talked about the Harmon family, and the state of their well, and whether there was anything the valley could do that hadn't been done already. Tom Greeley offered to lend them his secondary pump, Duncan said. But Greeley's pump is older than Greeley. It works, though. It works when it wants to, same as Greeley. Eliza laughed. It came out before she could make any decision about it, and it sounded odd to her own ears. She didn't laugh much these days. Hadn't laughed much in years, really, the way you stop doing things gradually until one day you notice the absence. Duncan looked at her sideways when she laughed, not like he was startled by it, more like he was registering it, filing it somewhere. The fence post was solid. She let go of it, brushed the dirt from her hands. "The valley's talking about you," she said. Straightforward, because she had decided being straightforward about it was better than pretending it wasn't happening. "I know. Does it bother you?" He thought about it, which was a thing she'd come to recognize about him. He didn't answer immediately, the way most people do, filling the air before they decided what to fill it with. He actually thought and then spoke. "It bothers me less than it used to," he said. "That's not a no." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." They walked back toward the barn in the late afternoon light, which was finally lasting past 5 o'clock, a measurable improvement over December. She wanted to ask him what had happened to him, specifically. What had built the walls that the valley had learned to mistake for the whole man? She didn't ask because she understood intuitively that there was a pace to these things, and pushing past it served nothing but your own curiosity. What she knew by March was this. He read. History mostly, some natural philosophy, a few novels he mentioned offhandedly. He had opinions about weather that were more accurate than the almanac. He had built his cabin and his outbuildings himself over 2 seasons, which explained their quality. He'd had a dog once, a big mixed breed that had died the previous winter, and the way he said it, flat, brief, moving on, told her exactly how much it had cost him to lose it. He didn't have good relationships with most men in the valley, not from any particular hostility on his part, but because most men in the valley had decided who he was before he'd opened his mouth, and it was exhausting to work against a conclusion people had already reached. She understood that particular exhaustion. Not in the same way, her version of it was different, smaller, the low-grade tiredness of a woman who'd been told in 100 small ways that what she was did not quite measure up to what she should be. But the shape of it was recognizable. She didn't tell him this. Not yet. What she told him instead on the last day of March, when they were standing at her kitchen table going over the seed inventory she was trying to figure out for spring planting, was this. "I want to show you something." She pulled out the ledger. The real one, not the version she showed to anyone who asked. The actual numbers, 2 years of them, organized in her precise schoolteacher's hand. Income, expenses, the gap between them that had been growing with the reliability of a tide. Duncan sat down and read it. He read the whole thing without speaking. "You knew it was this bad," he said finally. "I knew the shape of it." "This is more than the shape." He turned a page. "This is the debt column. You've been servicing this against the teaching wages for 2 years, yes. What's the note on the property?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "Who holds it?" "Blackridge Savings, Walter Crane." She paused. "The Reverend's brother." "Who is not the Reverend?" "No. Walter Crane is not a man of strong charitable instincts." Duncan closed the ledger. She watched him doing whatever he was doing in his head with the numbers. "You're not going to lose it this year," he said. "The winter was hard enough that you're behind, but you're not at the cliff edge yet." "Not yet," she agreed. "But next year, if it goes the same way, I know." She took the ledger back. "I'm not telling you this because I want you to solve it. I'm telling you because you've spent 2 months helping this farm, and you should know what you're dealing with." He looked at her steadily. "What I'm dealing with," he repeated, like he was deciding something about the phrase. "That came out differently than I meant it." "No," he said. "It came out right." They looked at each other across the table, and that particular thing happened again. The thing that had been happening more often since the night of the storm, since the coffee cups and the washed cup turned upside down to dry. A kind of reckoning, quiet and mutual, the kind that doesn't have language for it yet and isn't ready for language, but is real regardless. She looked away first. "I have papers to grade," she said. "I'll check the north fence line before I go." She nodded and picked up her papers, and he went outside, and she sat at the table for 5 minutes not reading anything before she made herself start. The first time the town said something directly to Eliza about Duncan, not behind her back, not in the store where she could pretend not to hear, was in the 2nd week of April outside the community hall after a meeting about spring road repair. Agnes Whitfield appeared at her elbow, which was never accidental with Agnes. "People are talking," Agnes said without preamble. Agnes didn't do preamble. "People were talking in February," Eliza said, "and October. I suspect people will be talking in June." "This is different." Agnes kept her voice low, not unkind. "It's not just gossip now. There are people saying you've made some kind of arrangement with him, that you've encouraged a connection that isn't appropriate." Encouraged? Eliza felt the word sit badly. What does that mean, exactly? It means they think you're allowing him to become attached to you in exchange for labor and supplies. The implications of that settled slowly, and then all at once. They think I'm using him, Eliza said flatly. Agnes said nothing. Or they think he's using me, and I don't have the sense to see it. Either way, someone is being exploited by someone. I'm not saying that's what I believe. I know you're not, Eliza exhaled. What are you saying? Agnes was quiet for a moment. She was not a woman who said things carelessly, which was part of what made her Agnes. I'm saying that the Valley watches everyone. You know that. And a woman in your situation, with your property debt, and she paused, your particular circumstances. People will make a story out of it, whether you give them the material or not. They're already making a story out of it. Yes, but you could be more careful about the fuel you give them. Eliza looked at this community hall behind them, at the lit windows where people were still talking, and thought about Duncan's ledger reading and the washed coffee cup, and the way he said what I'm dealing with like he'd made a decision out of it. Agnes, she said, what do you think I should do? Agnes straightened her coat, which was Agnes buying time. I think you should be very sure about what you want before you let this go further. Because once it does, once the Valley has decided what this is, you cannot undecide it for them. I know. He is not an easy man. I'm not an easy woman. Agnes looked at her long enough that Eliza felt it. No, Agnes said finally. I suppose you're not. She walked back inside and Eliza stood in the April cold for a while, not ready to follow yet. The Valley spread out in the darkness around her, beginning to wake up from winter, everything muddy and half-broken and starting again. She thought about easy, about what easy would look like, and whether she'd ever actually had it, and whether at 31, with a struggling farm and a teaching job and a deficit ledger, she'd earned the right to want something that wasn't just manageable. She drove home and went to bed and lay there with the window cracked because the air finally smelled like mud instead of ice, which was progress. What? The speculator arrived on a Tuesday in late April. He came in a wagon that was too clean for the Valley roads, with a young man who appeared to serve as his secretary and took notes on everything with the focused energy of someone paid to look thorough. His name was Harlan Price. He was from Billings, he said, which meant nothing to most people in the Valley except that it was a city and he was not from here. He was not a large man, medium height, medium build, the kind of face that was pleasant in a calculated way, like the face had been arranged for professional purposes. He wore a good coat and good boots, and he shook hands with people in a manner that seemed warm until you thought about it afterward and realized there had been no warmth in it, just the correct motions. He had come, he said, to offer opportunities to struggling landowners, generous, fair market purchase prices for properties that had suffered in the winter. He was representing an interest, he said, in developing the Valley, bringing investment, creating employment, building something that would benefit the entire community. He did not specify what investment or what employment. He went to the Harmon place first. Eliza heard about it through Frances Dodd, who heard about it from Margaret Harmon, who had cried during the conversation with Price and then spent 2 days being angry at herself for crying. He offered them $800, Frances said. Eliza did the arithmetic. That's half what the property is worth. Maybe less, but when you're looking at what they're looking at, Frances stopped. He knows they're desperate. He knew before he knocked on the door. Eliza thought about the ledger. Her ledger. She thought about what a man like Price would see when he looked at Black Ridge Valley, which was not a community, not people, not 40 years of accumulated labor and loss and survival. He would see a spreadsheet. Distressed assets at below-market prices, purchased with the certainty that the Valley's misfortune was its own problem to manage. She sent a note to Duncan with old Bert Cassidy. There's a man named Harlan Price. He's been to the Harmons. I think you should know about him before he comes to me. The reply came back the same afternoon, again on brown paper, again in the deliberate handwriting. I know. He was at the Connolly place this morning. Don't sign anything. I'm looking into where he's from. She read it twice, then set it down. Don't sign anything. As if she'd needed to be told, though she was glad to have it said. She was glad specifically that someone who was not asking for thanks or payment had said it. Someone who had spent a winter proving that his investment in her farm and her situation was real and had no obvious price tag. She put the note in the small box with the other one. Tick. Price came to her place on a Thursday afternoon. She was in the schoolyard when she saw his clean wagon coming up the road, and she took her time finishing what she was doing, sending the last children home, before she walked out to meet him. He got down from the wagon with the smoothness of a man who'd done this many times. The secretary stayed on the seat with his notebook. "Miss Hartwell," Price said, which told her he'd done his research because she hadn't introduced herself yet. "I've been hoping to speak with you." "I gathered." She looked at him steadily. "What can I do for you?" "I think it might be more a matter of what I can do for you." He said it with the smile that was professionally warm. "I understand you've had a difficult winter. Many people in the valley have. I'm here to offer to buy my property at below market value," she said. The smile didn't leave his face, but something shifted behind it. He hadn't expected directness. Most people, she suspected, hadn't given it to him. "I'm here to offer a fair price for land that has, as I understand it, a debt position that makes it—" "You've looked at the Blackridge savings records. They're public documents." "They are." She held his gaze. "So you know exactly what my position is, and you've calculated the number that sits just above the point where I'd have to seriously consider it." He looked at her for a moment, recalibrating. "You're an intelligent woman," he said, and the condescension in it was so slight that it could have been her imagination, but it wasn't. "This farm belonged to my father," she said, "and before you tell me that sentiment is not a financial strategy, I know. I'm not making a sentimental argument. I'm telling you that I know what it's worth, and I know what you're offering, and those two numbers are not the same, and any conversation between us that pretends otherwise is a waste of both our time." He tilted his head slightly. "And if your situation changes, if your position becomes more constrained, then I'll make a different decision, with a different number." He nodded, slow, like a man storing information. "Well, I'll be in the valley for a few more weeks, in case your thinking evolves." He got back in the wagon and drove away, and Eliza stood in the road until he was out of sight. Her hands were steady this time. She thought about "in case your thinking evolves," the patience in it, the certainty that her thinking would evolve if he waited long enough, because the mathematics were on his side and he knew it. The debt was real. The ledger was real. The gap between what the farm earned and what it cost was real. She stood there in the spring evening, on land her father had broken his back for, and did not let herself make it into something it wasn't. It was a problem, a serious one, and Harlan Price was not wrong that time was on his side. But he had made one miscalculation, she thought. He'd come to this valley assuming that every person in it was alone with their problem. He hadn't yet accounted for what it meant that he wasn't. Duncan's research took him 4 days and cost him 2 trips to the county seat at Harlan, which was a half-day's ride each way on roads that had not fully recovered from the mud season. What he came back with was not a smoking gun. It was worse than that. It was a pattern. Price had done this before. Not in this county, not in this territory, but in 2 others. Both documented in land registry records that were public and boring and told a very clear story if you knew how to read them. A hard winter or a drought or a flood. Some event that left landowners exposed. And then Price, appearing shortly after, with his clean wagon and his practiced handshake, buying up distressed properties at fractions of their value. In one county in eastern Montana, 17 properties in 18 months. In another, 11 families displaced in a single summer. What Price did with the land afterward varied. Sometimes he sold it to railroad interests. Sometimes he consolidated it and ran cattle on the scale that individual family farms couldn't compete with. Sometimes he simply held it and waited for the value to recover, which it always did eventually, because land did not stay cheap forever. He was not technically breaking the law. That was the thing. He was doing what the law permitted, which was to identify people in desperate circumstances and offer them less than their assets were worth, and let the math of desperation do the persuading. The families signed willingly, not because they wanted to, but because staying meant drowning slowly, and leaving meant drowning fast, and at least leaving came with enough money to start somewhere else. Duncan spread the papers on Eliza's kitchen table on a Thursday evening and walked her through it. She read everything twice, He watched her face, which was the face of a person processing something that made them angry, but who was managing the anger deliberately. The way you'd manage a fire, you needed to stay controlled. He's done it to 30 families, she said finally. At least 30. That's what's in the records I found. There may be more. And the law can't, not for what he's doing. Buying cheap from willing sellers isn't a crime. He paused. But I want to know where his money comes from. That's what I haven't found yet. A man like this, moving from county to county, he's not operating on his own capital. Someone is backing him. And if we find out who's backing him, then we know what we're actually dealing with. Eliza was quiet for a moment. She put the papers back in order with the precise habit of a school teacher. How many people in this valley have already talked to him? 6 that I know of: Harmons, Connolly's, the widow Samuels, and 3 others on the North Road. He hesitated. He went to the Cassidys. Bert didn't tell you? Bert doesn't tell me things he thinks will worry me. Well, he's been to Bert. Eliza closed her eyes briefly. Old Bert Cassidy had worked his patch of land for 30 years. He had no family, no one coming after him, and the only reason his acreage mattered was because it was his, and he'd made it. What did Bert say to him? Bert told him to get off his land or he'd introduce him to the dog. Bert's dog has been dead for 2 years. Price didn't know that. Despite everything, something that was almost a smile crossed her face. It didn't last long. Duncan. She looked at him directly. If he's been to 6 properties already, he's not going to stop. And some of those families are in real trouble. The Harmons almost sold in April. They may sell in May. I know. We can't just research him forever. At some point, there has to be something that actually stops him. He looked at her across the table. He'd been thinking about this since before he'd gone to the county seat. Had in fact been thinking about it in a specific direction that he hadn't yet said out loud. There's a town meeting next week, he said. Road repair. That's what it's supposed to be about. Yes. I want to come. She looked at him, read something in his expression. You haven't been to a town meeting in 4 years. I know. People will make of it what they make of it. He said it like he'd arrived at this conclusion through effort rather than ease, which was honest. He's working on the assumption that everyone in this valley is separate. Separate problems, separate decisions, no one talking to anyone else. The moment the valley sees itself as one problem, his model doesn't work anymore. Eliza looked at the papers on her table. The moment the valley sees itself as one problem. She thought about winter and the way the hardship had been distributed, each family carrying their own weight of it alone, and how the weight had been slightly less only when it was shared, when Bert checked on her, and she checked on the Harmons, and Frances brought news, and the whole imperfect patchwork of people held something together that no one person could have held. All right, she said. He nodded. Neither of them said anything else about it that night. They went over the documents once more, and Duncan noted 2 names that appeared repeatedly in the financial filings behind Price's previous acquisitions. A land investment group out of Helena that was not prominently listed but was consistently present, a shadow in the paper trail. He took the name down. It was something to pursue. He left at his usual time just before dark. At the door he stopped. Eliza. He didn't turn around immediately. What? He turned. Whatever happens at the meeting, however it goes. A pause that had weight to it. You should know that I'm not doing any of this because I feel obligated. She looked at him. I know, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went out into the evening, and she closed the door. Decil. The week before the town meeting, Price moved faster. He must have sensed something shifting. The way a man who does what he does develops instincts about resistance forming, because he made 3 more visits in 5 days. He went back to the Harmons with a revised number, slightly higher, presented with the urgency of a man who needed an answer quickly because he had other interests competing for his capital. Mrs. Harmon came to Eliza's school on a Wednesday afternoon, the children still in their seats, and stood in the doorway with a face that was trying not to show how tired it was. He came back, she said. I heard. Eliza told the children to read chapter 4 independently and came to the door. What number? 900. Still not what it's worth. I know what it's worth, Eliza. Margaret Harmon's voice was patient in the way of a woman who'd been through enough to have no patience left for people who told her what she already knew. I know, but Warren's back isn't right since February, and we've got the two youngest who need winter clothes and the grain loss, and I know. Eliza caught herself. I'm sorry, I know you know. Margaret looked at her hands. He said the offer was good until Friday. That's a pressure tactic. It probably is. She looked up. But what if it isn't? What if he does pull the offer, and the next one is lower? Eliza didn't have an answer for that, which was the honest position to be in. She didn't have a counteroffer. She didn't have money to loan them, or a guarantee that the Valley would somehow solve this before Price's patience ran out. She had Duncan's documents and a town meeting 4 days away. Come to the meeting Monday, she said. Bring Warren. Town meetings don't fix debt. They don't. But this one might be different. She held Margaret's gaze. Just come. Please. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, doing the calculation of trust, which was what you always did when someone asked you to wait on something you couldn't afford to wait on. Friday, she said. He wants an answer by Friday. The meeting is Monday. I know the timing is bad. Tell Warren that. But there was something still open in her voice, not fully closed. I'll talk to him. She left. Eliza went back inside to 12 children staring at Chapter 4 with the focused inattention of students who had been listening to everything. Read, she said. Buckingham. Price was at the meeting. Nobody had told him about it. He'd apparently made it his business to know the Valley's calendar, which was the kind of thing a man like Price did, staying ahead of the information. He arrived before it started and stood near the back with his secretary and his cordial expression, and when people noticed him, there was a ripple through the room that was part irritation and part unease. The meeting was called by Harold Webb, who was the closest thing Blackridge had to a mayor, without technically being one. He owned the mill and had the kind of community standing that came from being consistently less wrong than other people. Webb was not a dramatic man. He was practical and slow-speaking, and he'd planned to spend 45 minutes on road repair funding and call it a night. The road repair discussion lasted 10 minutes before someone brought up Price, and then it became a different meeting. It was Tom Greeley who started it. Tom Greeley was not the most reliable voice in the Valley. He drank and he talked, and most people knew to add a discount to whatever he said. But he had a farmer's directness, and tonight it served him. Man's been to half the North Road properties in 2 weeks, Tom said, loud enough for the whole room. Buying up land like he's collecting fence posts. I want to know what the council's going to do about it. Webb said, carefully, that there was nothing illegal about private property transactions. Legal doesn't mean right, Tom said. No, Webb agreed. It doesn't, but it does mean it's outside the council's jurisdiction. From the back of the room, Price said, I appreciate the clarification, in a tone that was professionally modest and somehow also made clear that he had expected exactly this outcome. The room did not like that tone. You could feel it, the collective bristling of people who understood they were being managed. It was in that particular moment that Duncan Voss stepped forward from where he'd been standing against the side wall, and the room shifted. It shifted the way rooms shift when something unexpected happens. Not panic, not excitement, but a sudden alertness, a reorientation of attention. People who hadn't seen him since the matchmaking gathering stared openly. People who'd seen him around town stared anyway. He was hard not to look at, standing in the community hall in his dark coat with the particular stillness he carried everywhere, and the room went quiet in the way rooms sometimes do before something that cannot be taken back. Harold Webb said, Duncan, in a tone that was not unwelcoming but was uncertain. Duncan looked at Price first. Not long, just a look, taking stock, the same kind of look he gave terrain he was about to cross. Then he faced the room. I want to speak, he said. Webb nodded. Most of you know who I am, Duncan said. His voice was not loud, but it had the quality of his size, filling space without forcing itself. A lot of you don't know me. Those are different things. No one said anything. I've been looking into where Harlan Price comes from and what he does. I went to the county seat and I looked at the land records for the 2 territories he operated in before this one. He bought 30 properties, 30 families. He let that sit for a moment. He didn't develop the land. He didn't create employment. He held it and sold it to rail and cattle interests when the price recovered. The families got their below-market checks, and they left. And the valley they'd built became something that belonged to no one who'd ever lived in it. The room was very quiet. Price spoke from the back, measured and pleasant. Those are public records being selectively interpreted. The families I've worked with. We're desperate and running out of options, Duncan said. He didn't raise his voice. That's not interpretation. That's what the records show. He turned back to the room. I'm not a lawyer. I can't tell you this is illegal. It's not. But I can tell you it's a strategy, and it only works if we let him pick us off one at a time. He paused. Eliza watched him from where she was seated, watched the room watching him, and saw the thing she'd known was true. That these people had decided who he was years ago and were having to revise that decision in real time, which was a process that showed on their faces whether they wanted it to or not. Eliza Hartwell's property has a debt position that makes it a target, Duncan said. The room looked at her. She kept her face still. Mine doesn't, he said. My land is clear. My timber rights are assessed at roughly $4,000 in current market. Another pause. I'm putting them in trust as loan collateral for any property in this valley that's at risk, available to any family that needs bridge financing until they can recover. The terms will be whatever the families can manage. There's no clock on it. The silence that followed was a different quality than the silence before it. He wasn't finished. As for Eliza's farm, he looked at her from across the room, and in front of everyone in Black Ridge Valley, in the community hall with its permanent smell of pine resin and old coffee, he said, She's my choice. She's been my choice since October. I am not, I have never been, a complicated person to understand. I know what I want, and I don't want other things. The room did not make a sound. The farm has a debt I can service. The property is worth twice what anyone in this room has been pretending it's worth, because Eliza Hartwell has worked it alone for 6 years, and the work is in every fence post and every acre of it. He finally looked away from her, back at the room. I'm not asking anyone's permission. I'm telling you how it is, so there's no more speculation about what either of us is doing. Clara Potts, to her lasting credit, did not say anything. Tom Greeley, to almost no one's surprise, said, Well, I'll be, and then apparently ran out of words. Harold Webb cleared his throat. Duncan, the trust arrangement. Are you prepared to document that formally? I'll have documents drawn by end of next week. Webb nodded slowly, the nod of a man recalibrating. Then I think... He looked at the room, which was still doing its collective adjustment. I think the town of Black Ridge owes you its attention, at minimum. From the back of the room, Harlan Price said nothing. He was watching Duncan with the expression of a man doing arithmetic on a problem that had just become significantly harder, and the number he was arriving at was not to his liking. Eliza sat in her seat. Her face was composed. Her hands in her lap were not fully composed, but they were hidden. She's my choice, said in front of everyone, with no performance in it, no flourish. Just a man stating a fact because the fact had needed stating, and he was tired of it going unstated. That was so completely, recognizably him that she almost laughed, and did not, because the room was still watching. She looked at him across the hall, and he looked back, and she gave him the smallest nod she had in her. Barely anything, less than a quarter inch of movement, and he received it the way he received everything, steadily, and then looked away. Price left the meeting before it concluded. He didn't make an exit of it, just collected his secretary and walked out with the quiet efficiency of a man recalculating in motion. The door closed behind him. Several people watched it close. Webb reconvened the formal business, road repair, funding sources. The practical machinery of a community that had been reminded tonight that it was one. The discussion was different than it had been. Not dramatic, not transformed, just slightly more real, the way conversations get when something honest has been said in the room recently. After the meeting, people came to Duncan. Not the whole room, Tom. Some people left quickly, still recalibrating, not ready to revise years of conclusion in a single evening, but enough. Hank Pierce shook his hand, which Hank almost never did with anyone. Margaret and Warren Harmon stood with him for a few minutes, talking quietly. Eliza couldn't hear what was said, but Warren Harmon's posture was the posture of a man who had just been given something he wasn't sure how to carry yet, but intended to try. Agnes Whitfield appeared at Eliza's shoulder. "Well," Agnes said. "Don't," Eliza said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You had a look." "I don't have a look." "Agnes, you have a look." Agnes was quiet for a moment, then, "He's a better man than this valley gave him credit for." "Yes," Eliza said. "He is." She didn't say "I told you so" because she hadn't told anyone anything. She just refused to accept other people's version of him when she had evidence of her own. That wasn't prophecy. That was just paying attention. She made her way through the clearing room to where Duncan was standing, the crowd having thinned around him, and stood next to him the way she'd stood at the food table in October, not performing anything, just there. He looked at her. "That was—" she started and stopped. "Too much?" he said. Not quite uncertain, more like a man who had done a thing he knew he couldn't take back and was genuinely willing to hear whether it had been wrong. She thought about She's My Choice in front of 40 people, and Clara Potts and Harold Webb and Tom Greeley, thought about it, said plainly, "No decoration, just the fact of it." "No," she said, "not too much." His shoulders settled fractionally. She saw it because she'd learned to read the small things in him. The economy of a man who didn't use more movement than he meant. "Price will retaliate," he said. She knew that. She'd known it from the moment he'd spoken. A man with that much money and that clear a strategy didn't absorb a public setback and accept it. He adjusted. He found another approach. He used what leverage remained. "I know," she said. "I'm not sorry I said it. I'm not asking you to be." They stood there in the emptying hall, not yet moving toward the door, both of them understanding without saying it that what had just happened was not a conclusion. It was the point in a story where the real difficulty starts, where the easy part of deciding something becomes the hard part of living with the decision. The fiddle player who'd been hired for the evening was packing up his instrument in the corner. The lanterns were burning lower. Outside, the April night was cold and smelled like turning earth and coming rain. Eliza picked up her coat from the chair where she'd left it. "Walk me to my wagon," she said. He did. The rain that had been threatening all evening arrived before Eliza reached home, and by morning it had settled into the steady, determined kind that meant it wasn't finished with the valley yet. She stood at her kitchen window with her coffee and watched it come down and thought about Price's face in the moment before he left the meeting. That small recalibration, the arithmetic working behind his eyes. Duncan had been right. The retaliation came faster than either of them expected. It came on Thursday, 2 days after the meeting, in the form of a letter delivered to Eliza's door by a man she didn't recognize. Not Price's secretary, someone else, older, with a sheriff's deputy look about him, though he wore no badge. The letter was from a legal firm in Helena. It stated, in language that was precise and thoroughly unpleasant, that Harlan Price had filed a claim against the Hartwell property on the basis of a pre-existing lien she had not been aware existed, a secondary debt instrument attached to the original deed, dating back to a transaction her father had made 12 years ago, which had apparently been purchased quietly by an investment interest connected to Price's backers at some point in the past 2 years. Eliza read it 3 times. She was not a woman who panicked. She'd trained that out of herself through necessity, the same way you train yourself not to flinch from cold water. Enough immersion and the instinct changes. But this was different from the slow arithmetic of a deficit ledger. This was someone who had found a structural weakness she hadn't known existed and was standing on it with both feet. She sent for Duncan before noon. He read the letter standing at her table, which he did quickly and without asking her to explain any of it. She watched his expression and saw what she'd come to recognize as his version of anger. Not heat, not agitation, but a kind of stillness that was denser than his ordinary stillness, like the air before lightning. "You didn't know about this, Leanne," he said. "I had no idea. My father never mentioned any secondary instrument. He was not a financially complicated man. The purchase date on this Helena interest. That's 14 months ago." He looked up. "Someone knew Price was coming before Price got here, or Price found this and went looking for whoever held it." Either way, the lien is real. I don't know yet. These instruments can be fabricated or misrepresented. I need to see the original deed, and I need to see the chain of title. He set the letter down. I need to go back to the county seat. That's 2 days round trip. I know. And while you're, I'm not leaving you here alone with this open. He said it plainly, no drama in it, the same way he'd fix a fence post. This needs doing. Here's how. I'll go Monday, come back Tuesday night. Between now and then, we don't let him pressure you into anything. No meetings with Price or his people without me present. I don't need you to be present for my meetings. He looked at her. You're right, he said. That came out wrong. I mean, don't let them isolate you. Don't let this become a conversation between you and his lawyers with no one else in the room. She accepted the correction. It was the right version of what he meant. What if the lien is legitimate? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then we deal with what it actually is, not what they want us to think it is. There's a difference between a legal instrument and a weapon. He picked up his coat. And I have not yet seen a weapon I couldn't find the length of. She almost told him, then almost said the thing that had been accumulating since the meeting, since she's my choice in front of 40 people. She didn't, because Monday was not the day for it. Monday was for the county seat and the chain of title and whatever Price was going to do before Duncan got back. She walked him to the door. Be careful on the north road, she said. The rain will have taken sections of it. I've ridden worse. I know you have. She paused. That doesn't mean I can't say it. Something moved in his expression. He held her gaze a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a practical conversation about road conditions. I'll be back Tuesday, he said. Oh, Sunday was quiet in the way of days with bad weather underneath them. Eliza went to check on the Harmons in the afternoon, partly to see how they were, partly because Margaret had left the meeting Monday still undecided, and Eliza had not followed up the way she'd intended. The road to the Harmon place was soft, and she went on foot, the 1.5 miles not worth risking the horse in that mud. Margaret was in her kitchen when Eliza knocked. She looked tired in the specific way of women who had stopped sleeping because the waking problems were too loud. Warren and I talked, she said, before Eliza had taken off her coat. And? We're not selling. She said it like a woman who has made a decision and is not sure if the decision is brave or foolish and has decided it doesn't matter. Whatever your Duncan figures out with the lien business, we're not selling. He's not my Duncan, Eliza said, and then heard how that sounded and did not address it further. Margaret gave her the look. He said, she's my choice, in the middle of the community hall. He did. And you're going to tell me he's not your Duncan. I'm going to offer you tea, Eliza said, and we're going to talk about the lien. Margaret got the tea things out, which was acceptance. They talked through what Eliza knew, which was not enough, and what she suspected, which was more. If Price had a legitimate lien on the Hartwell property, it was a lever, not just against Eliza, but against the credibility of the trust arrangement Duncan had proposed, because if the anchor property of that arrangement was legally compromised, the whole structure wobbled. Price was not just retaliating. He was trying to dismantle the meeting's outcome from underneath. He's smart, Margaret said. Yes. I don't like that he's smart. Neither do I. Margaret wrapped her hands around her cup. What does Duncan think he'll do next? He thinks there may be more instruments like this, other properties. He went to look at the county records. Because there might be other liens. Margaret's face went through something careful and then settled. He's not just doing this for you. No, he's doing it for the valley. I think, Eliza said slowly, that he's been doing things for this valley for 6 years, and no one noticed because they were too busy deciding he was a problem. Margaret was quiet for a while. I owe him an apology, she said finally. You could tell him that when he gets back. I will. She looked at her tea. Warren, too. He said some things after the gathering in October that, well, men say things. They do. So do women. They do, Eliza agreed. They sat with that, 2 women in a warm kitchen while the rain made its case outside, and something shifted in the room that wasn't about price or liens or any of the machinery of the problem, just 2 people who had been carrying their troubles in separate houses, setting them down in the same space for a moment. Duncan came back Tuesday evening, later than he'd said. The horse was tired, and he looked like a man who had ridden hard in bad weather and found things he didn't want to find. He came straight to Eliza's farm. She was still up, had been up, had told herself she wasn't waiting and had been waiting anyway. He sat at her table and spread out what he'd brought back, and she put coffee in front of him and didn't ask questions until he'd had some of it. "The lien is real," he said. She sat down. "It's legitimate in the sense that your father took on a secondary instrument in 1881, against the advice of the deed agent at the time, to finance the original stock purchase for the herd. It was a short-term note that was supposed to be retired in 2 years. He turned a document toward her. It wasn't retired. It rolled over, twice. The original holder sold it to a land trust in 1890, which sold it to a Helena investment group in early 1892, which is connected to Price, which is his primary backer. He pointed to a name on the document. Northwestern Territorial Land Associates. They've appeared in every acquisition Price has made across the 3 territories. They're the money behind him. They find the instruments, they find the distressed properties, and Price is the face that knocks on the doors. Eliza looked at the name. Northwestern Territorial Land Associates. A name like a sentence that meant nothing and everything. What's the instrument worth? The original note was $200. With 12 years of unaddressed interest, the way they've calculated it, they're claiming $460. She absorbed this. "I don't have $460, she said. There was no distress in it, just the plain fact. "No, but I do. Duncan, it's not a gift." He held her gaze, steady, preempting the argument. "It's the same arrangement I offered the Valley at the meeting. Bridge financing. You pay it back when you can, on terms you can manage. The difference is that this one has a deadline." He reached for another document. "They've filed for immediate collection, which under the territorial statute means they can move to encumber the property in 30 days if it isn't satisfied." 30 days. "I can have the funds to Walter Crane at the savings bank by Friday. That retires the lien and removes their legal basis for the encumbrance." He paused. "But Eliza, this is not the end of it. Even if we retire this one, they will look for other instruments, other angles. Price is not going to accept a single defeat and go home." She knew that. She'd known it since Thursday. "What is the end of it, then?" He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him arriving at the harder part of what he'd found. "I found 2 more liens, not on your property, on the Connolly place and the old Samuels farm." He spread the documents. Same structure, same originating instrument from the same period, different amounts, but the same chain. Original note, rolled over, sold to Northwestern. He came prepared. He came with a map. His voice was flat. He didn't come to Blackridge Valley because the winter was hard. He came because someone did title research on every property in this valley before he arrived and identified every deed with a vulnerability in it and purchased the instruments months in advance. He looked at her. "He's been planning this since last fall, before the first snowfall." The implication of that settled fully. Before the first snowfall, the cause, which meant Price, or whoever directed him, had looked at Blackridge Valley the way you'd look at a hunting ground and identified which animals were already wounded before the season started. "How many properties are exposed?" she asked. "I found 3. There may be more I didn't see. We need to tell the Connollys and the Samuels' widow. I stopped at both on the way back." He drank his coffee. "Connolly didn't know. He was not in a good state when I left." She could imagine. Patrick Connolly was a proud man, proud in the way that made receiving bad news in front of anyone feel like its own additional injury. And Ruth Samuels? Ruth Samuels is a 72-year-old woman who has outlasted 3 bad husbands and 2 droughts, and she told me that Harlan Price could come collect his instrument in person, and she would introduce him to her fence wire. Duncan's expression was not quite a smile, but it was something. "She's something, that woman." "She is." Eliza looked at the documents. 3 properties, 3 instruments, a systematic strategy that had been invisible until Duncan had gone and looked at it from the right angle. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "The Helena interest, Northwestern. I pulled their filing records. They have a territorial charter. Land acquisition is their stated purpose." He paused. But there's a secondary filing, a rail corridor application filed with the territorial government 8 months ago. He pointed to a section of a document she hadn't yet looked at. The corridor runs through this valley, north to south, straight through the middle of it. If they acquire enough of the land in the path, the railroad. She looked up. This was never about distressed farming properties. No, the farming properties are just what's in the way. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it, not rage, something colder than rage. This whole valley, everything everyone here has built for 40 years, it's a survey line to them. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the matchmaking gathering in October and a man at a food table who'd fixed her shed in the dark. She thought about a winter that had tried to break everyone in it. She thought about 30 families in 2 other territories who had taken their checks and left, and valleys somewhere in Montana and Wyoming that belonged now to interests in Helena and nobody who'd ever turned the soil. "We need to show this to Harold Webb," she said. "Yes. And we need to get it to the Territorial Land Office. If the corridor application is still open, it's still open. The comment period doesn't close until June." He met her eyes. A documented pattern of fraudulent acquisition, combined with testimony from families across 3 territories, could challenge the charter. That's a lot of documentation. It is. He didn't make it sound simple, which was part of what she trusted about him. He never made things sound simpler than they were. But we have the records, and I know a lawyer in Harlan who owes me a debt that isn't financial. "You're full of surprises," she said. "You have no idea," he said, and this time it was fully, plainly a joke, and she laughed. Actually laughed, the same way she'd laughed in March about Tom Greeley's pump. And it was the first time in days that anything had been light enough for that. Isech. Thursday night the weather came back. Not rain this time. The season had tipped past that, into something that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be spring or give winter one more attempt. It came in hard from the north, and by midnight it was a genuine storm, the kind that made the trees sound like they were arguing with each other. Eliza woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of her dogs barking. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, which was a farmer's reflex, and at the window in 20 seconds. The east pasture was visible in the flashes of lightning, empty, normal. But the dogs were still going, not the bark of animals or weather, the bark of strangers. She took the rifle down from the wall hook. She was at the back door, boots on and coat over her nightgown, when the dogs suddenly went quiet. That was worse than the barking. Dogs that go quiet have been addressed, one way or another. She opened the door. There were 2 men in her yard, visible in the storm's intermittent light. One was at the fence gate to the cattle area. The other was closer, near the barn, with something in his hand that she couldn't identify at this distance in this dark. "Get off my property," she said. Her voice came out level, which surprised her. The rifle was at her shoulder. The closer man turned toward her. He couldn't see the rifle well in the dark, apparently because he didn't stop moving toward the barn. "We're just here to look at something," he said, loud against the wind, with a casualness that was performed for her benefit. "Mr. Price has an interest in this property. We're assessing it. At 2 in the morning. Time got away from us." The man at the gate had gotten it open. She could see him moving toward the fence post line, toward the area where the property markers were. She understood, with a cold and immediate clarity, what they were doing. They were there to alter or remove survey markers, to create a physical basis for a boundary dispute that would compound the lien action and make the legal situation more complicated and expensive to fight. She fired once, into the air above the closer man's head. The sound in the storm was enormous and immediately clarifying. Both men stopped. "Next one is not a warning," she said. The man near the fence line made a decision visible in the changed posture of someone who has just recalculated their employment terms. He stepped back from the fence post. "Lady, do not speak to me." She kept the rifle up. "Both of you walk back to whatever road you came in on. Do it now. If I can see either of you from this door in 30 seconds, the next shot will not be pointed upward." They left. Not running. Men like this didn't run. It was a point of dignity. But they moved, and inside of a minute they were through the front gate and the sound of horses picked up and then faded into the storm. She stood in her doorway for a while after, the rifle still up, until she was certain. Then she lowered it and stood there in the wind and the rain and breathed. Her hands were shaking, not the slight tremble of anger, the full-body kind, the kind that comes after the moment is over and the body presents its bill for what it just managed. She let them shake. She leaned against the doorframe and let the reaction run through her, and thought about what had just happened and what it meant. It meant Price had moved past financial instruments and into something else. It meant the 30 days was a fiction. He intended to complicate this beyond the 30 days, to make the legal situation so muddied and expensive that the property would collapse under the weight of fighting for it, even if the lien was retired. It meant she could not do this alone. She was back inside, the door locked, when she heard the knock at the front. She spun, rifle up again, every nerve reignited. "Eliza," Duncan's voice through the door. "It's me. Open up." She crossed the room and opened the door. He was soaked through, his coat dark with water, mud on his boots from the road. He looked at her, the rifle, the nightgown, the expression on her face, and read all of it in 2 seconds. "I saw them on the North Road," he said, recognized one of them. He was with Price's wagon when Price first arrived. He came inside, pulling the door shut against the wind. "I was coming anyway. I had a feeling he'd move tonight." He paused, looking at her more carefully now. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Did they—" "I fired a warning shot and they left." She set the rifle against the wall. "They were going for the survey markers." He stood there, dripping on her floor, and for a moment they were both simply in the room together with the storm outside and the adrenaline still working through both of them. Then he exhaled. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." "Eliza, sit down, Duncan." He sat down. She put the kettle on with hands that were still not entirely steady, and she thought about Price and Helena somewhere, or in a room at the boarding house in Blackridge, moving his pieces around a board he thought only he could see. He hadn't accounted for this. For her, specifically, for a woman who woke at 2 a.m. and reached for her rifle before she reached for her fear. For the fact that the valley he'd mapped from a land registry had people in it who did not behave like entries in a column. She brought the coffee to the table. Duncan wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at her across it. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go to Webb. All of it. The liens, the corridor application, tonight. Everything at once. He needs the documents. He'll have them." He looked at his coffee. "I also think we need the Harmons and the Connollys and Ruth Samuels at that meeting. Everyone Price has touched. A single complaint from one property is a nuisance. 6 families with documented evidence of a coordinated strategy. Is something a territorial magistrate can't ignore. That's what I'm hoping." She looked at him across the table, this man who had come through a storm in the middle of the night because he'd had a feeling, who had ridden 2 days to a county seat and come back with a map of what they were actually facing, who had said, "She's my choice," in front of a room full of people who'd spent years reducing him to a warning. "Duncan," she said. He looked at her. She didn't have the exact words for it. They hadn't arrived yet in the form she wanted. What she had was the thing underneath the words, which was real and had been real for some time and didn't require language to be what it was. "Thank you," she said. "Not for tonight, for all of it. Since October." He held her gaze for a long moment, and something in his face did what it rarely did, opened, just slightly, the way a door opens an inch before you decide to open it fully, to see what's on the other side. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "I know I don't. I'm giving it anyway." The storm pressed against the house, and outside the valley was dark and wet and full of problems that weren't solved yet, and they sat with their coffee and let the night do what it was going to do, and it was enough. For right now, with the rifle leaning against the wall and the survey markers still standing where they belonged, it was enough. Harold Webb looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. It was Friday morning, early enough that the light was still coming in low and sideways through the mill office windows. Eliza and Duncan sat across from Webb's desk, and the Harmons were behind them on the bench along the wall, and Patrick Connolly had come in from his place still wearing his work boots with the mud from the morning chores on them. Ruth Samuels had driven herself, which was a thing people always mentioned when Ruth Samuels drove herself anywhere, because she was 72 and the road from her farm was not forgiving and nobody could tell her anything about it. Webb read everything. He was slow and thorough, and he didn't ask questions while he read, which was a quality Eliza had always respected in him. When he finished, he set the documents down in a neat stack and looked at Duncan. "You got all of this from the county seat," he said, "and the territorial registry in Helena, my second trip. You made 2 trips. The first one told me I needed a second one." Webb looked at the corridor application, which was the last document in the stack. He'd held it longer than the others. "If this rail corridor goes through, it divides the valley in half," Duncan said. "The acquisition pattern they've been running isn't random. They need a continuous strip of land for the right-of-way. The properties price targeted are all in that strip." Webb set it down. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man running numbers he didn't like the outcome of. Behind Eliza, she could hear Warren Harmon's breathing, careful and controlled, the way you breathe when you're holding something together. "The comment period on the corridor application closes in June," Eliza said. "We have time to file a formal objection, but it needs to be collective. Property owners in the projected path, documented evidence of the acquisition strategy, the cross-territorial pattern. A single objection from a single family goes in a pile. 6 families with a documented record of coordinated predatory acquisition." "Is a different document," Webb said. "Our lawyer in Harlan says it's enough to trigger a territorial investigation," Duncan said. "Not a guarantee, but enough to freeze the application while the investigation runs. That could take 6 to 18 months. And price? Price depends on the corridor approval to make the acquisition economics work. If the application is frozen, the investment calculus changes. Northwestern Territorial's backers are patient, but they're not patient forever. 18 months of frozen application with an active investigation." He paused. "I've seen what happens to speculative land positions when the timeline extends past the investment horizon. They sell." Webb looked at him. "You know a great deal about investment horizons for a man who lives on a mountain." "I read," Duncan said. Ruth Samuels from the bench near the wall said, "Good for you," without looking up from her hands, which she was studying with the focus of a woman who had decided this meeting was taking too long. Something loosened in the room. Not much. The problems were real, and the documents were real, and nobody in that office had the money to pretend otherwise. But enough. Webb stood up. "I'll talk to the council today. Collective objection, my endorsement as community representative. I'll want signed statements from every affected property owner by Wednesday." He looked at the room. "Can we get that?" "I'll ride the North Road tomorrow," Duncan said. "I'll take the South," Eliza said. Webb looked at them both for a moment. A brief, unguarded look. The look of a man registering something he'd missed for a long time and was adjusting to. "All right," he said. "Let's build this thing." Ja. The following 3 weeks were the hardest work Eliza had done that didn't involve physical labor. She rode the South Road in the afternoons after school, stopping at each property that Price had touched or threatened to touch, sitting in kitchens and at fence lines, and once in a barn with a man who refused to be seen agreeing to anything in a place where his neighbors might notice. She explained the corridor application. She showed the documents. She answered questions she didn't always have full answers to, and when she didn't know, she said so, which was a thing that either built trust or didn't, and mostly it did. Some people said yes immediately. Some took days. 2 families on the south side said no. One because the patriarch had already shaken hands with Price and considered that binding, and one because they had made a calculation that the fight wasn't worth the cost of fighting, which Eliza understood even when she couldn't accept it. She drove home on those evenings through the late spring light, which was lasting longer now, the days finally earning the warmth they'd been promising since March. And she thought about what it meant to ask people to stay and fight for something when leaving was also a legitimate option. When it was someone else's farm, someone else's decision. She had no standing to tell the Morley family that their homestead was worth more than the trouble of defending it, because she didn't have to live with the trouble. She just had to live with the outcome. Duncan was riding the North Road with the same work and the same uneven results. They met at her kitchen table most evenings that week to compare, which meant she was tired from teaching and writing, and he was tired from writing and the lawyer correspondence, and they sat across from each other drinking coffee that had been reheated twice and talked about legal strategy and property owners, and whether Tom Greeley's signature was worth the trouble of getting it. It was, they decided, because Tom Greeley talked, and his talking would carry the news in directions they couldn't reach directly. One evening, Wednesday of the second week, she fell asleep at the table. Just Went. Mid-sentence, or close to it, the exhaustion collecting its debt without asking permission. She woke up with her head on her arms and the lamp turned down low and a blanket over her shoulders that had not been there when she sat down, and Duncan was gone, and on the table next to her was a note in his handwriting that said only, "Connolly's signed, 9 confirmed, 2 more tomorrow." She sat up, stiff-necked and disoriented, and read the note twice, and thought about the blanket, which was the kitchen blanket from the peg near the stove, placed with the care of someone who was trying not to wake her. She held that for a while in the quiet kitchen, this small and ordinary piece of evidence about who he was. Then she got up, blew out the lamp, and went to bed. The formal objection was filed on a Monday in late May, 12 days before the comment period closed. 11 signatures, 11 property owners, Harold Webb's endorsement as community representative, and a 40-page attachment of documented evidence that Duncan and a lawyer named Abrams from Harlan had assembled over 2 weekends and more coffee than was good for either of them. The objection cited cross-territorial acquisition patterns, the lean instrument strategy, the Thursday night survey interference, documented by Eliza's written account, dated and witnessed, and the financial connections between Northwestern Territorial and Price's operational history. Abrams had called it, in a letter to Duncan, the most organized land fraud documentation I've seen in 15 years of territorial practice, which is either impressive or alarming, depending on how you feel about what it says about this territory. Duncan had written back, both. The Territorial Land Office acknowledged receipt in 2 weeks. 3 weeks after that came the letter they'd hoped for. The corridor application was placed under administrative review pending investigation of the objection. The review would run a minimum of 8 months. All pending acquisition activity related to Northwestern Territorial's interests in Black Ridge Valley was to be suspended pending the investigation's findings. Eliza read the letter on her porch on a June afternoon, the valley green and legitimate around her, everything growing with the uncomplicated determination of things that don't know they nearly didn't make it. She read it twice. Then she put it down on the porch rail and looked out at the pasture where Twice was grazing with the other cattle, fat and indifferent to her own significance in this story. She thought about a man coming across a white field in February with her heifer on his shoulders. She thought about how easy it would have been, any point along the way, to be what the valley expected her to be. Diminished, cautious, grateful for whatever was left over after everyone else had taken their assessment of her. She was not beautiful by the valley's accounting. She was not young in the way that frontier youth was valued. She was heavy and plain and stubborn, and she had a deficit ledger and a farm that ran on nerve more than margin. And somehow, looking at that, a man from a mountain had said, "That's the one." Not because she was easy or uncomplicated or without difficulty, because she wasn't. She was still sitting there when she heard the wagon on the road. But Duncan came up the track with the kind of deliberateness that meant he already knew what the letter said. Abrams had sent him a copy directly, she realized. He tied the horse at the fence post, the same post he'd sunk 6 months ago in frozen ground, and came up to the porch with his hat in his hand. He looked at her, at the letter on the porch rail, back at her. "It's done," he said. "For now." "For now," he agreed. "The investigation will take time, and there will be things to respond to, and it won't be clean." He was always honest about what was ahead, never pretended difficulty was less than it was. But Northwestern won't hold a frozen position for 8 months. Abrams says they've already inquired about the exit provisions. Price? Left the valley 2 weeks ago, his boarding house room cleared out overnight. A pause. He'll find another valley somewhere. That's the hard part. She knew. One valley defended didn't mean the pattern ended. It meant the pattern moved. There was no perfect resolution to that. Just the fact of what they'd done here, with this land, for these people, which was real even if it wasn't complete. "The Harmons," she said. "Warren starts on the new well section next week. Connolly's grain stores are covered through fall from the bridge loan." He paused. "Ruth Samuels told me I could use her fence line pasture for my horse any time I needed it, which, from Ruth Samuels, is approximately equivalent to a medal." Eliza laughed. It was a real one, the kind that came from somewhere that had been closed for a long time and was open again. Duncan looked at her when she laughed, the same way he'd looked in March and the time before that, registering it, keeping it. She stood up from the porch chair. "There's something I want to say," she said. He waited. He was good at waiting, this man, good at giving things the space they needed instead of filling it with noise. "You said something at the meeting in April that you meant plainly, and I received it plainly, and I haven't said anything back about it because the timing was always wrong or the work was too immediate or I was—" She stopped. Started again. "I was afraid." That's the honest answer. Not of you, of what it means to choose something and mean it. He held very still. "I've been chosen wrong before," she said. "Not viciously, just chosen by someone who wanted a version of me that fit better into his life than I did. And when that ended, I told myself for years that I was fine with what I had. The work, the farm, the school. That was enough. And I was fine with it being enough." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not fine with it anymore." The air between them was the particular quality of something that has been a long time arriving. "I'm not asking you for easy," she said. "I don't think either of us knows how to do easy. I'm asking you for this, what we've been doing, except without the pretense that it's something other than what it is." Duncan stood there on her porch in the June afternoon, hat in hand, and she watched him arrive at the same place she'd just arrived at, through his own terrain, at his own pace. "I've known what this was since October," he said. "Since apple cake." She blinked. "Since apple cake." "You told me it was better than it looked." His voice was not quite dry, but close to it. "Nobody had talked to me like that in years, like I was just a person standing near food." She looked at him. "That's what you— a woman who wasn't afraid of me and wasn't trying to manage me and wasn't performing anything. You were just tired and hungry, and you told me the truth about the cake." He held her gaze. "I knew what I wanted right then. It took me until the meeting to say it in front of anyone." There it was again. The plain-facedness of him. The way he stated things without decoration, without the social cushioning most people layered around the things that mattered to them. It was not romantic in the way of stories. It was better than that. It was a man saying, "This is true," and standing behind it with everything he had. She crossed the porch and she kissed him, which was not something she'd planned to do in advance, and was the right decision anyway. It was not a graceful moment. She misjudged the distance slightly, and he'd been surprised, actually surprised. She felt it in the half second before he caught up. And his hat fell off somewhere. It was clumsy and real, and when they separated, she was close enough to see the specific gray of his eyes up close, which was not the color of storm after all, she decided, more like early morning, before the weather settled into whatever it was going to be. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She bent down and picked up his hat and held it out to him. He took it. "You should stay for dinner," she said. "I have the garden beans and the last of the winter ham, and I'm not going to apologize for that being the meal." "I wasn't going to ask for an apology." "Good." She opened the porch door. "Come inside." July in Black Ridge Valley was the valley at its most itself. Warm, but not brutal. The grass is tall, the creek running with the snowmelt from the high ridges that hadn't finished coming down yet. The community hall opened its side walls on summer weekends, and whoever had a fiddle came by, and whoever wanted to eat and talk found themselves there without much planning, which was the best kind of gathering because nothing was required. It was at one of these loose summer evenings that the valley's attitude toward Duncan Voss finished its transformation, or at least completed enough of it to matter. He came with Eliza. That was the simple version of it. He came and he stayed and he talked to people, not with the performance of a man trying to be liked, but with the ordinary social engagement of a man who had decided that this community was his and was willing to spend some of himself on it. He talked to Warren Harmon about the well project. He talked to Hank Pierce about sheep fencing in late-season weather. He talked to Tom Greeley for 20 minutes about something that made Tom Greeley laugh, which was a sound the hall received with visible surprise. Agnes Whitfield, appearing at Eliza's elbow with the inevitability of gravity, said nothing for a moment, then, "You were right about him." "I wasn't right about anything," Eliza said. "I just didn't accept other people's wrong." Agnes considered this. "That's a distinction. It's the important one. Because that was the thing. Eliza had not seen something in Duncan that others had missed through insufficient perception. She had simply refused to accept a story that had been built from fear and distance, which was not wisdom so much as stubbornness applied in the right direction. Most of the Valley's version of Duncan Voss had been constructed from what they didn't know about him, which is how most people's worst reputations are built. Not from evidence of who they are, but from the shape of what's unfamiliar. He'd been alone up on that mountain for 6 years, not because he was broken or strange or incapable of human connection, but because the only connections available to him had required him to pretend he was less than he was or something other than he was, and he'd refused to do that. That refusal had looked like pride or damage from the outside. From the inside, it was just a man who knew what he was worth and wouldn't negotiate it down. Clara Potts spoke to Eliza that evening, which Eliza had not expected. She came up with the directness of someone who had thought about what they wanted to say and decided to say it rather than continue carrying it. "I said unkind things," Clara said, "in October and after, about you and about him." "You did." "I was wrong about him." A pause. "I may have been wrong about you, also. The things I assumed about your situation." She looked uncomfortable, which was probably appropriate, and was also something Eliza hadn't seen on Clara's face before. "I'm not going to give a speech about it." "I wasn't expecting one." "Good." Clara straightened her collar. "You make a sensible pair is what I actually think, now that I'm looking at it correctly." It was not a lavish apology. It was Clara Potts at the outer edge of what Clara Potts was capable of, which meant it was genuine in the way that only things at their limit can be genuine. "Thank you, Clara," Eliza said. Clara nodded and walked away, and Eliza watched her go and thought about how long it takes people to revise things, and how revision is the whole of what growing up actually is. Not certainty, not arriving somewhere, just the ongoing willingness to look at what you assumed and say, "I need to look at that again." The territorial investigation ran 7 months, which was toward the shorter end of the estimated range. In November, Northwestern Territorial Land Associates reached a settlement with the Territorial Land Office, not an admission of fraud because their lawyers were thorough, but a withdrawal of the corridor application and a divestiture of the Black Ridge Valley lien instruments, which were transferred to the affected property owners at the original instrument value with no accrued interest. Effectively, the Hartwell lien died for $200, what it had originally been worth. 12 years of compounding simply erased by the settlement terms. Abrams sent Duncan a letter that said, in its professional way, that outcomes like this happen perhaps one time in 5 at the investigation stage, and that the quality of the documentation had been the determining factor. Duncan showed Eliza the letter. She read it. She handed it back. "Keep it," she said. "You rode to Harlan twice for that. You stayed up half the winter for this farm." "Then we both keep it," she said, and put her half with the 2 notes in the small box where she kept things she didn't want to lose. The debt on the Hartwell property, the real original debt, the deficit ledger she'd shown him in March, took 2 more years to retire fully. It was not glamorous. She taught school through both winters, and Duncan's timber operation had a good season in the 2nd year, and they were deliberate and careful with the numbers, and at the end of it the ledger was finally, actually clear. She didn't celebrate exactly. She sat with the final column for a while and let it be what it was, which was the product of a lot of years of work and a few months when the right person had stood next to her while she did it. They married in the spring of the 2nd year, which is to say they had a small gathering at the community hall with the people they'd chosen to invite and nobody else. And Eliza wore a dress that wasn't 3 years old and fit correctly, and Agnes Whitfield cried, which surprised everyone, including Agnes. It was not a perfect day. The fiddle player arrived late. Duncan said his part in a voice that was audible only to the people in the first 2 rows, which was not the whole room, but was enough. Eliza tripped slightly on the hem of her dress on the way out, which was the kind of thing that happens and is fine, and later became one of those stories you tell about your own life with the particular affection you develop for the moments that didn't go smoothly. What happened in the years after is the part of a story that doesn't get told because it doesn't have the shape of a story. It has the shape of a life, which is different. There were good years and hard years, and the farm became something that could sustain itself, not abundantly, but steadily, which was all she'd ever asked of it. Duncan's timber operation grew enough to employ 2 men from the valley by the 4th year, which meant 2 families with income through the winters, which was the specific kind of thing he seemed most interested in. Not legacy or recognition, just the practical fact of people being less cold. The valley changed, slowly, the way places change when they survive something together. Not transformed into something unified and harmonious, people were still people. Clara Potts still had opinions. Tom Greeley still drank more than was good for him. The roads were still terrible in mud season. But there was a different quality in the community hall in those summer evenings, a different ease in how people talked about their own hardship, as if the winter of '93 and everything after it had left them with a shared language for difficulty that they hadn't had before. And there was Duncan Voss, who sat at those gatherings with the same stillness he'd always had, but was no longer a warning. He was just a man, imperfect, private, occasionally difficult to understand, genuinely useful in ways that mattered, chosen by a woman who had decided that the valley's version of him was not the version she was going to live by. He had not been waiting for someone perfect. He'd been waiting for someone who wasn't afraid to stand next to him in the actual conditions. Not the imagined ones, not the easy ones, but the February blizzard and the 2 a.m. rifle and the reheated coffee and the years of work it takes to make something out of something that was barely holding together. She had not been waiting for someone easy. She'd been waiting for someone real. The distinction, it turned out, made all the difference. There is a thing that happens if you live in a place long enough with someone long enough. The place and the person stop being separate. The east fence line is where he sunk the post in frozen ground. The cattle shed is where he worked in the dark without asking for credit. The kitchen table is where they laid out the documents that saved 11 families, and where she fell asleep from exhaustion and woke up with a blanket on her shoulders. Eliza Hartwell, Eliza Voss, after the spring of that 2nd year, understood that a life is not made in its large moments. It's made in the accumulated weight of the small ones. Who brought the wood, who stayed through the storm, who was still there at the table when the coffee had been reheated twice, and the problems weren't solved yet, and there was still a long way to go. That's all love is, stripped of everything that gets layered onto it, the willingness to stay at the table. Duncan had stayed. She had stayed. The valley had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to be something more than a collection of separate households carrying separate troubles in the dark. And outside the window, through every season that came after, the fence post held.